January 1943. High above western Germany, the sky is thin and brutal. At 25,000 feet, aluminum bombers crawl forward in rigid formation, engines strain. Frost creeps across oxygen masks. Inside the fuselages, there are gaps where men once stood, empty gun positions. Shattered plexiglass, blood frozen into metal seams. Below them, smoke still rises from yesterday's raid. German flak crews look up and hesitate. Fighter controllers check their boards again. This is not what was supposed to happen. The last mission tore the American formations apart. Dozens of bombers destroyed, hundreds of airmen killed or captured. Losses so severe that any rational enemy would stop. Yet the contrails are back. Over the roar, civilians hear the familiar distant thunder and feel something colder than fear. Confusion, a creeping realization that destruction alone is not enough. That even after losing half their crews, the bombers keep coming. In Berlin, reports stack on desks. Calculations no longer make sense. Attrition was meant to break this force. Instead, it has revealed something worse. And as the formations push deeper into German airspace, a new question begins to form, one that will haunt the Reich for the rest of the war. By the beginning of 1943, the war in Europe had entered a new phase. Germany was still powerful, still dangerous, but the certainty of early victory was gone. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht had just suffered a catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. An entire German army was destroyed. The illusion of invincibility cracked in the snow. In North Africa, Axis forces were being pushed steadily westward. And in the skies over Western Europe, a new enemy was beginning to assert itself with growing confidence. For the first time, the United States Army Air Forces were ready to fight Germany directly and in daylight. The concept was radical, even controversial. British Bomber Command, bloodied by early losses, had already abandoned daylight raids. They'd bombed at night, trading accuracy for survival. The Americans chose the opposite path. They believed that tight bomber formations, heavy defensive firepower, and precision bombing could cripple Germany's war industry without unsustainable losses. At the center of this belief was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress 4 engines. 10 guns, thick aluminum skin. Crews were told it could fight its way through enemy airspace. That mutual defensive fire would protect the formation. That discipline and altitude would compensate for vulnerability. It was not arrogance, it was doctrine, tested in theory and limited combat. Germany studied this doctrine closely. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, still possessed a sophisticated air defense network. Radar stations stretched from the North Sea to the Alps. Fighter control rooms tracked incoming raids minute by minute. Anti-aircraft guns ringed every major industrial region. This system had a clear goal: inflict losses so severe that daylight bombing would become impossible. Attrition was the weapon. German planners understood numbers. They calculated crew survival rates. They knew that bomber crews required months of training. That replacement aircraft took time to build. That morale had limits. If they could destroy enough bombers often enough, the Americans would be forced to stop, just as others had before them. Early results seemed to confirm this logic. In 1942, American daylight raids were limited and cautious. But by early 1943, the USAF escalated. Missions pushed deeper into occupied Europe. Targets expanded from coastal facilities to inland industrial centers, ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, submarine yards. Every mile inland increased the danger. German fighters learned to exploit weaknesses. Head-on attacks shattered formations. Coordinated assaults tore through bomber boxes. Flak grew heavier, more accurate. Bombers returned riddled with holes. When they returned at all, loss rates climbed. For bomber crews, statistics were brutally simple. A typical combat tour required 25 missions. By mid-1943, the odds of completing the tour were grim. Entire crews vanished in minutes. Survival became a matter of chance rather than skill. German intelligence officers noticed the trend and drew conclusions. No air force, they believed, could sustain this. No nation would continue to send men into such losses without pause. Attrition was not just destroying aircraft, it was eroding will. Each downed bomber was a message. Each dead crewman a warning. The expectation inside the Reich was clear: the Americans would slow down. Then stop, then reconsider daylight bombing altogether. The Luftwaffe prepared accordingly. Fighter units were reinforced. Tactics refined. Pilots briefed not on defense but on annihilation. The goal was no longer to intercept but to break the force entirely. And when certain missions ended with staggering American losses, German commanders believed they were witnessing the turning point. They waited for silence in the skies. Instead, the bombers began forming up again. The distant engine noise returning over England signaled something deeply unsettling, because it meant the war in the air was not being decided by numbers alone. It was being decided by endurance. By the summer of 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign had become impossible for Germany to ignore and impossible for its defenders to fully stop. Every mission followed the same pattern. At dawn, airfields across eastern England came alive. Crews walked silently toward their aircraft, passing ground crews who avoided eye contact. Engines started in sequence. One by one, heavy bombers lifted into the gray sky and began assembling into vast formations over the coast. From above, they looked orderly and unstoppable. From inside, they felt fragile. The targets now lay far beyond the reach of early Allied operations. Deep in the German heartland were factories that fed the Reich's war machine: steel, synthetic fuel, precision components. Among the most critical were ball bearings, small, unglamorous parts that kept engines, vehicles, and aircraft running. Without them, modern war slowed to a crawl. Schweinfurt became the symbol of this strategy. Located in central Germany, it was surrounded by layers of defenses. Flak batteries dotted the countryside. Fighter bases ringed the region. Any bomber force heading there would spend hours inside hostile airspace, exposed from the moment it crossed the coast. German commanders knew this. They waited. On August 17, 1943, the Americans struck Schweinfurt and Regensburg in a daring double mission. The idea was simple and risky: split German defenses, hit two critical targets at once, and keep moving forward. It was the deepest penetration yet. The cost was staggering. Dozens of bombers were shot down. Hundreds of aircrew were killed or captured. Aircraft returned riddled with damage so severe that many were scrapped immediately. The mission achieved partial success, but at a price that alarmed even American commanders. Inside Germany, the reaction was different. Luftwaffe leadership saw confirmation of their strategy. Fighter pilots reported easy kills. Flak units recorded unprecedented success. Intelligence officers calculated loss ratios and smiled. These were not sustainable numbers. The Americans had pushed too far, too fast. Then came October. On October 14, 1943, later known as Black Thursday, the US AAF returned to Schweinfurt. The escort fighters could not go the distance. Bombers were once again on their own. What followed was devastation in the air. German fighters attacked relentlessly. Waves of interceptors tore into the formations. Bombers exploded mid-air. Parachutes dotted the sky. Entire groups vanished before reaching the target. Out of 291 bombers dispatched, 60 were destroyed. Many more were damaged beyond repair. Nearly 600 airmen were lost in a single day. From a German perspective, this should have been decisive. Reports flowed upward through the chain of command. Loss rates were highlighted, charts drawn. Conclusions made. No force could continue like this. The Americans had reached the limit of endurance. Inside the US AAF, the debate was fierce. Some commanders argued for a pause. Others questioned daylight bombing altogether. Crew morale was under severe strain. Replacement rates struggled to keep pace. Training pipelines were stretched thin, yet the bombing did not stop. Within weeks, new formations appeared over the Reich. Aircraft that should not have existed, flown by crews who should have refused. Targets shifted, but the pressure remained constant. German civilians noticed first. Air raid sirens sounded again and again. Factories were repaired, only to be struck once more. Night bombers from Britain came after sunset. American bombers arrived in daylight. There was no rest. German fighter pilots began to report something unsettling. Even after suffering catastrophic losses, the American formations did not break. Bombers flew straight and level through flak. Crews stayed in formation even when aircraft around them were torn apart. Damaged bombers struggled onward instead of turning back. This behavior did not match expectations. Attrition was supposed to produce hesitation. Instead, it produced repetition, predictability, a grim, mechanical persistence that felt less like human decision-making and more like an industrial process. In German command centers, planners began to understand the problem. They were not fighting an air force trying to survive. They were fighting an air force designed to absorb loss. And as the next waves of bombers assembled across the English countryside, German defenders prepared, once more uncertain now whether destruction alone could ever be enough. That uncertainty would soon give way to something darker. The first angle was human, and it began inside the bombers themselves. For American aircrews, fear was not abstract, it was mathematical. Each mission carried a known probability of death or capture. They counted empty bunks. They memorized the faces that did not return. Crew rotations brought new men into positions once occupied by friends. Yet the missions continued. This endurance was not born from ignorance. Crews knew the loss rates. They read the briefings. They saw the damage on returning aircraft. What held them in formation was not confidence in survival, but obligation. To the men beside them. To the crews ahead and behind. Breaking formation meant exposing others. Staying together was the only defense they had. The second angle was leadership. At the highest levels of the USAAF, commanders faced a dilemma without precedent. The doctrine of daylight bombing was being tested under the harshest conditions imaginable. Abandoning it would mean conceding the skies to Germany during the day. Continuing meant accepting casualties on a scale that was politically and morally difficult. They chose continuation. This decision was not reckless, it was strategic. American leadership understood industrial war differently. They believed that sustained pressure applied relentlessly would overwhelm Germany's ability to respond. Losses were tragic, but interruption was worse. Momentum mattered more than comfort. German intelligence misunderstood this calculation. The third angle was perception, how the enemy interpreted American behavior. Luftwaffe analysts expected hesitation after heavy losses. Instead, they observed consistency. Mission frequency remained high. Formation sizes stabilized. Targets shifted logically rather than emotionally. This suggested a command structure insulated from fear. For German planners, this was deeply troubling. They had built their defense around the assumption that pain would alter behavior, that pilots would refuse missions, that commanders would pause, that politics would intervene. None of that happened. From the cockpit of a German fighter, the view was equally unsettling. Pilots watched bombers absorb punishment that should have crippled them. Aircraft flew with engines out, tails damaged, wings shredded. Crews bailed out only when survival was impossible, not when fear suggested retreat. German aces began reporting that American bombers felt less like aircraft and more like moving fortresses. Not invulnerable, but stubborn? This perception gap widened with every mission. What Germany believed would break the Americans instead revealed a structural difference between the two war economies. The fourth angle was technological, and it revealed a quiet imbalance beneath the violence. The American bomber force was built with redundancy in mind, multiple engines, overlapping gun coverage. Crews trained to keep aircraft flying even when systems failed. Damage tolerance was not an accident, it was a design philosophy shaped by industrial thinking. If enough aircraft reached the target, the mission was considered successful, regardless of individual losses. German defenses, by contrast, relied on precision. Fighters were deadly but limited in number. Pilots were highly trained but irreplaceable. Flak guns were powerful but required massive logistical support. Each interception demanded coordination, fuel, and experienced crews. The system worked, but only if it could force the enemy to stop coming. It never did. The fifth angle was psychological. For German civilians, the terror was not just the bombs, it was the predictability. Day after day, the same ritual: sirens, explosions, smoke, recovery, then repetition. There was no sense of resolution, only continuation. The bombers returned even after losing dozens of aircraft. That persistence eroded faith in protection, in leadership, and in eventual victory. Within the Luftwaffe, morale began to shift. Pilots flew multiple sorties a day. Fatigue accumulated. Losses mounted among veteran airmen who could not be replaced at the same rate. Younger pilots entered combat with less training, facing increasingly experienced American gunners. Each mission demanded more effort for diminishing returns. The sixth angle was moral, and it was unspoken. The bombing campaign raised questions on both sides. For Americans, the human cost was immediate and personal. Crews paid in blood for strategic theory. For Germans, civilian suffering became inseparable from military production. Factories and neighborhoods blurred together. Precision was promised, but war rarely delivered it cleanly. Still, the campaign pressed on. German leadership struggled to adapt. Increasing flak density meant diverting guns from the Eastern Front. More fighters meant fewer resources elsewhere. Every response created a new vulnerability. The bombers forced Germany to react, not choose. The realization slowly settled in German command circles. This was not a test of firepower. It was a test of endurance, and Germany was not winning it. When the next major missions were planned, German defenders prepared for another violent confrontation. They expected heavy losses on both sides. What they did not expect was the moment when persistence itself would become the decisive weapon. That moment would arrive not in theory, but in the sky during a mission where everything that could go wrong did, and yet the bombers continued. The morning began like many others, but the air felt heavier. Before dawn, airfields across eastern England stirred to life. Briefing rooms filled with cigarette smoke and quiet murmurs. Target maps were unfolded, routes traced in grease pencil. Weather officers spoke in careful tones. Crews listened without interrupting. They already understood the risks. The target lay deep inside Germany. By mid-morning, the bombers were airborne. Hundreds of aircraft climbed slowly, forming up over the coast. From above, the formation stretched for miles. Order imposed on chaos. Once assembled, they turned east, crossing the North Sea and entering enemy airspace. German radar detected them almost immediately. Fighter control rooms lit up, phones rang. Orders were issued with precision born of long practice. Interceptor units scrambled from airfields across the Reich. Flak crews stood by their guns, calculating altitude and speed. The first attacks came before the bombers reached the target. German fighters struck from the front, closing head-on at high speed. Cannons fired in short, lethal bursts. Bombers shuddered as shells tore through noses and cockpits. Some exploded instantly. Others fell out of formation, trailing smoke. The formations tightened. Crewmen fired until barrels overheated. Gunners tracked targets through frost-covered sights. Pilots held their course even as the sky filled with debris. Damage reports crackled over intercoms, followed by long silences. As the bombers pressed deeper, the attacks intensified. Wave after wave of fighters cut through the formations. Flak bursts blackened the sky, forcing aircraft to fly through explosions that tossed them violently. Wings flexed, engines failed. Control cables snapped. Losses mounted with terrifying speed. Entire squadrons were reduced to fragments. A bomber would disappear, leaving only drifting wreckage. Parachutes opened below, some never deploying fully. Crew survival depended on altitude, luck, and whether German fighters chose to fire on descending men. Still, the formations did not turn back. German commanders watching the radar screens saw something unprecedented. Even as loss rates reached levels that should have forced mission aborts, the bomber stream continued toward the target. There was no mass retreat, no collapse, just steady movement forward. For the Luftwaffe, this was the moment of confusion. They had planned for destruction. They had prepared for the breaking point. Instead, they were witnessing a force that absorbed punishment without changing behavior. As the bombers approached the target area, their numbers were already severely reduced. Gaps yawned in the formations. Defensive fire thinned. Many aircraft flew damaged, barely controllable. And yet, they pressed on. The decisive moment was no longer about bombs or factories. It was about whether the Americans would finally stop. They did not. The bomb bay doors opened. And in that instant, the meaning of the campaign changed forever. Over the target, the sky became a furnace. Flak concentrations intensified as the bombers reached their aiming points. Shells burst in tight patterns, calculated to shred aircraft flying straight and level. Bomb bay doors were open now, locking the bombers into their most vulnerable posture. Pilots held course by instinct alone. Bombardiers stared through Norden sights, adjusting for drift and altitude as explosions rocked the aircraft. Bombs fell. Industrial complexes below erupted in fire and smoke. Shock waves rippled outward. Rail yards buckled, factories vanished beneath dust clouds. For those seconds over the target, the mission still mattered. Even aircraft that would not survive the return pressed on long enough to release their loads. Then the formations turned west. For German defenders, the expectation was simple: the retreat would become a rout. It did not. Damaged bombers regrouped where they could. Lone aircraft limped onward, staying aloft through sheer mechanical stubbornness. Crews worked frantically, plugging fuel leaks, fighting fires, redistributing weight. Gunners continued firing even as ammunition ran low. German fighters pursued relentlessly. Attacks continued deep into the return route. Bombers fell one by one. Some ditched into the sea. Others crash-landed in occupied territory. Rescue chances were slim. Survival often meant captivity, yet enough aircraft made it back. When the final survivors crossed the coast and dropped out of enemy range, the meaning of what had happened began to sink in on both sides. For the Americans, the cost was staggering. Lost tallies were counted in dozens. Crew rosters were torn apart. Entire units were effectively destroyed in a single mission. The emotional weight settled in briefing rooms and barracks, heavy and unavoidable. But the campaign did not pause. Replacement aircraft were already en route. New crews arrived. Mission schedules remained intact. The machine absorbed the damage and continued operating. Inside Germany, the reaction was profoundly different. Luftwaffe commanders reviewed the data with disbelief. They had achieved exactly what their doctrine demanded: catastrophic losses inflicted on the enemy. And yet the strategic effect they expected did not materialize. Instead of collapse, there was continuity. Instead of hesitation, repetition, German intelligence reports began to shift in tone. Language changed. Where earlier assessments spoke of unsustainable losses, newer documents expressed uncertainty. Questions replaced confidence. If losses of this scale could not stop the Americans, what would? The psychological turning point was unmistakable. Germany had assumed the enemy would behave like they did, conserving elite forces, avoiding unacceptable casualties. The Americans did not. They operated on a different logic, one rooted in production capacity and institutional resilience rather than individual preservation. That realization was terrifying because it meant the bombers would keep coming, not because they were winning every battle, but because they did not need to. The air war was no longer about interception. It was about inevitability. And as German cities repaired the damage yet again and fighter pilots prepared for another scramble, the fear was no longer of the next raid, but of the one after that. In the days following the mission, the numbers came first. American loss reports were compiled with clinical precision. Aircraft destroyed. Aircraft damaged beyond repair. Crewmen killed, wounded, missing, captured. Entire bomber groups showed casualty rates that would have ended most operations in any previous war. The scale was undeniable, and within the US AAF, it forced immediate reassessment. High-level commanders did not ignore what had happened. Operational pauses followed, routes were reconsidered, targets reevaluated. Escort limitations acknowledged openly. The cost of deep penetration daylight bombing without continuous fighter cover had been proven beyond debate. But the campaign itself was not abandoned. That distinction mattered. For Germany, the immediate aftermath was filled with mixed signals. Factories struck during the raids reported serious disruption. Production slowed temporarily. Repairs began almost immediately, but skilled labor shortages and repeated attacks complicated recovery. Rail lines were rerouted. Power grids patched together under pressure. Civil defense reports painted a darker picture. Morale was no longer collapsing in sudden waves, it was eroding steadily. The knowledge that the bombers returned after such losses unsettled civilians more than the destruction itself. It suggested something relentless, something that could not be frightened away. Inside the Luftwaffe, the cost was also becoming visible. Fighter units that had performed brilliantly were burning out. Veteran pilots were lost in increasing numbers, not only to combat, but to exhaustion and accidents. Training programs struggled to replace them at the same standard. Younger pilots entered combat earlier, with fewer hours and less confidence. Attrition, once Germany's weapon, was now a shared burden. Internal memoranda reflected this shift. Early optimism gave way to concern. Commanders noted that even the most successful interception days failed to produce lasting strategic effects. Bombers returned, raids continued. Production resumed under pressure. The air defense system was working, but not decisively. Germany began diverting enormous resources to the skies. More flak guns were pulled from the front lines. Ammunition production was redirected. Fighter development accelerated. Everything became subordinate to air defense. This came at a cost elsewhere. The Eastern Front suffered from reduced support. Ground forces felt the absence of anti-aircraft units. Fuel shortages worsened as synthetic plants became targets themselves. Every bomber raid forced another compromise. For American aircrews, the psychological aftermath lingered. Survivors carried the memory of empty positions and lost friends into subsequent missions. New crews learned quickly what the statistics meant. Yet the structure around them, training, rotation schedules, command expectations, remained intact. The system did not ask if they were afraid. It asked if they were ready. As weeks passed and new raids followed, the true consequence of that pivotal mission began to emerge. It was not measured solely in bomb damage or aircraft losses, but in how both sides now understood the future of the air war. That future was becoming clearer. And it did not favor the defender. By early 1944, the shift set in motion by those brutal missions had fully taken hold. Germany's air defense strategy, once confident and aggressive, became increasingly reactive. Fighters were scrambled not to win air superiority, but to blunt the impact of the next inevitable raid. Flak belts expanded around cities at the expense of other fronts. The skies over the Reich grew crowded with guns and interceptors, yet the bombers still arrived. The cost of this defense was enormous. Fuel shortages intensified as refineries and synthetic plants were targeted. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of gasoline. Training hours were cut. Maintenance suffered. The Luftwaffe, once an elite force, was being worn down not by a single defeat but by constant demand. American strategy evolved as well. The lessons of catastrophic loss were not ignored. Long-range fighter escorts were accelerated into service. The P-51 Mustang, with its extended range and lethal effectiveness, changed the balance. For the first time, bombers were protected deep into Germany. German fighters now faced a new threat, one they could not easily escape. The psychological impact was immediate. Fighter pilots who once chose the moment of engagement now found themselves hunted. Losses mounted rapidly. Airfields were attacked, runways cratered, aircraft destroyed on the ground. The initiative shifted decisively. For German civilians, the sense of inevitability deepened. Raids increased in frequency and scale. Daylight and night bombing blurred into a continuous cycle. Cities lived in anticipation rather than recovery. Confidence in protection faded. The sky no longer belonged to Germany. In retrospect, the turning point was not the arrival of escort fighters alone. It was the moment Germany realized that attrition had failed. The American bombing campaign had absorbed losses that should have ended it. Instead of collapsing, it adapted. Instead of retreating, it expanded. That endurance forced Germany into a defensive posture it could not sustain indefinitely. Strategic priorities shifted under pressure. Resources meant for tanks, artillery, and infantry were diverted upward to the air war. The Reich was forced to defend everything, everywhere, all at once. By mid-1944, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The skies over Germany were no longer contested, they were controlled. The path to the invasion of Western Europe was opened not by a single battle, but by a campaign that refused to stop when it was supposed to fail. The terror Germany felt was not rooted solely in destruction. It was rooted in realization. The bombers would keep coming, and there was nothing left to make them stop. That understanding lingered long after the sirens fell silent, shaping how the war would be remembered and how future wars would be fought. In the end, the fear Germany felt was not simply of bombs falling from the sky. It was the fear of an enemy that did not retreat when logic said it should. An enemy that treated loss not as a signal to stop, but as a condition to endure. The American daylight bombing campaign revealed a new reality of modern warfare, one where industrial capacity and institutional resilience mattered as much as courage or skill. For the aircrews who flew those missions, endurance came at a terrible cost. Thousands never returned. Their sacrifice was not abstract. It was measured in empty bunks, unfinished letters, and aircraft that landed missing pieces of themselves. They did not know the war's outcome. They only knew the next mission time. For Germany, the campaign stripped away assumptions. Attrition failed to protect the Reich. Precision defenses could not stop mass. The sky, once a shield, became an open door. Fear replaced confidence, not because of a single defeat, but because persistence proved unstoppable. Historically, this moment reshaped warfare. Air power was no longer judged by brilliance alone, but by sustainability. Victory in the air became a question of who could keep flying when others would not. That lesson echoed into every conflict that followed, shaping doctrines, technologies, and moral debates that continue today. When historians look back, they do not see a single raid or a single loss ratio, they see a realization that sometimes the most terrifying weapon is not firepower, but the certainty that it will return tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that.